The hills of Los Angeles have always held a duality. By day, they are the sun-drenched epicenter of the American dream, a place where ambition meets opportunity, and where the beautiful people of the world come to seek their fortune. But when the sun sets, the canyons turn into labyrinths of shadow and silence. In the summer of 1969, that silence was heavy. The era of peace and love, the decade that had promised a cultural revolution, was beginning to curdle. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the idealism of the 60s was colliding with a darker, more chaotic reality. And on the morning of the 9th of August 1969, that reality arrived at a secluded estate on Cielo Drive, forever shattering the illusion of safety in Hollywood. This is not merely a story about a crime. It is a story about the end of an era, the rigorous application of forensic science in a time before DNA profiling, and the legal marathon that brought a group of manipulative killers to justice. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we must look beyond the mythology and focus on the facts, the victims, and the investigation that unraveled one of the most perplexing conspiracies in American criminal history. The setting was 10050 Cielo Drive, a French country-style home perched on a promontory in Benedict Canyon. It was a residence that symbolized success. At the time, it was rented by Roman Polanski, a celebrated film director, and his wife, Sharon Tate. Sharon was 26 years old, a woman of immense kindness and promising talent, and she was 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She was the embodiment of the future, radiant, hopeful, and on the verge of bringing new life into the world. On that Friday night, while her husband was away in London working on a film, Sharon dined with friends. They were Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist who had revolutionized the industry; Abigail Folger, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, who had dedicated herself to social work; and Wojciech Frykowski, an aspiring writer and friend of Polanski. The atmosphere in the house that evening was described as relaxed. It was a warm summer night, but outside the gates, a darkness was gathering. When the housekeeper arrived the following morning, the silence of the canyon was replaced by a scene of incomprehensible tragedy. The police were summoned immediately. When the first officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived, they were met with a chaotic and sprawling crime scene. It is important to note that in 1969, crime scene preservation protocols were not as rigorous as they are today. The officers were overwhelmed by the sheer number of victims and the senseless nature of the attack. They discovered 5 individuals who had succumbed to fatal injuries. Stephen Parent, a teenager who had simply been visiting the property's caretaker, was found in his car near the gate, a victim of terrible timing. Inside the house and on the lawn, the bodies of Tate, Sebring, Folger, and Frykowski were discovered. The brutality was evident, but what baffled detectives even more was the lack of apparent motive. There was no robbery. Expensive items were left untouched. The only message left behind was the word "pig" scrawled on the front door in the victim's blood. This was not the work of a burglar interrupted. It was a performative act of violence designed to shock. The investigation began in a state of confusion. The LAPD Robbery-Homicide Division was under immense pressure. The media descended upon Cielo Drive, and fear gripped the city. Gun sales in Beverly Hills skyrocketed. Security systems were installed overnight. The terrifying thought that someone could enter a fortress-like home and commit such atrocities without theft as a motive suggested a new, terrifying breed of criminal. Initially, the police looked at the usual suspects. They investigated drug connections. Suspecting a deal gone wrong, they looked into the victims' personal lives, searching for jealous ex-lovers or disgruntled employees. But every lead turned into a dead end. Just 24 hours later, miles away in the Los Feliz district, another tragedy struck. Tate-LaBianca, a supermarket executive, and his wife Rosemary were found dead in their home. The similarities were striking: the overkill, the lack of robbery, and again, Words written in blood at the scene, including the phrase, "death to pigs," and the misspelled Helter Skelter on the refrigerator. Despite these parallels, the LAPD initially treated the two cases as unrelated. Different divisions were handling the investigations, and communication silos prevented the detectives from connecting the dots immediately. This disconnect allowed the perpetrators to remain free for months. The breakthrough would not come from the homicide detectives initially, but from a completely unrelated investigation into auto theft and vandalism. In the desolate landscapes of Death Valley, specifically at a remote location known as Barker Ranch, law enforcement officers were tracking a group of hippies suspected of burning earth-moving equipment and stealing dune buggies. In October 1969, the California Highway Patrol and local sheriff's deputies raided the ranch. They found a disheveled group of young men and women living in squalor, led by a 34-year-old ex-convict named Charles Manson. At the time of the arrest, the police had no idea they had captured the individuals responsible for the Tate-LaBianca murders. They were booked for auto theft. It was a triumph of basic police work, checking vehicle identification numbers and following up on vandalism reports that brought the Manson family into custody. The bridge between the auto thefts and the murders was built on forensic ballistics and a jailhouse confession. When the family was arrested, police confiscated a specific revolver. Meanwhile, at the Tate crime scene, investigators had found bullet casings. Ballistic analysis, the study of the unique markings a firearm leaves on a projectile, confirmed that the gun found at Barker Ranch was the same weapon used at Cielo Drive. This was the first hard scientific link. However, the smoking gun was not enough to indict the specific individuals without a narrative. That narrative came from Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers. While incarcerated at the Sybil Brand Institute for Women, Atkins began to brag to her cellmates, Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard. She spoke with a chilling lack of remorse about the murders, providing details that only the perpetrators could know. She mentioned the writing on the door and specific actions taken during the crime. Ronnie Howard, disturbed by what she heard, contacted the authorities. This was the turning point. The information Atkins provided allowed detectives to cross-reference the physical evidence they had collected. They re-examined fingerprints found at the scene. A latent print lifted from the front door of the Tate residence was matched to Charles Tex Watson, one of Manson's lieutenants. Another print found at the LaBianca home matched follower Patricia Krenwinkel. The puzzle pieces were finally snapping into place. The investigation then shifted from who did it to why did they do it. This led prosecutors into the dark psychological labyrinth of Charles Manson's mind. Manson was a career criminal who had spent half his life in correctional institutions. He was not a mastermind in the traditional sense of being a genius. Rather, he was a predator who understood how to manipulate vulnerable people. He targeted young women who were often estranged from their families or disillusioned with society, using a mixture of sleep deprivation, psychedelic drugs, and repetitive indoctrination to break down their egos. The motive that emerged was bizarre and terrifying. Manson had become obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, specifically the song Helter Skelter. In his delusional interpretation, he believed the lyrics were a coded prophecy of an apocalyptic race war. Manson preached to his followers that Black Americans would rise up and overthrow the white establishment. He believed that he and his family would hide in a bottomless pit in the desert during this war, only to emerge later and rule over the survivors. When the race war did not start on its own, Manson decided he had to ignite it. The murders at the Tate and LaBianca residences were intended to be so gruesome that the police and the public would blame militant political groups, thereby triggering the societal collapse Manson desired. It was a motive born of deep-seated racism and megalomania. The trial, which began in June 1970, was one of the longest and most expensive in California history. The prosecution was led by Vincent Bugliosi, a methodical and relentless deputy district attorney. Bugliosi faced a significant legal hurdle. Charles Manson had not physically killed anyone at the Tate or LaBianca homes. He had tied up the LaBiancas, but he had left before the fatal blows were struck. At the Tate house, he hadn't even been present. To secure a conviction against Manson, Bugliosi had to use the legal doctrine of conspiracy and vicarious liability. He had to prove that Manson was the puppet master, the one whose will controlled the hands of the killers. The courtroom became a theater of the absurd. The defendants, Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, often disrupted the proceedings, chanting, singing, and carving X's into their foreheads, which they later altered into swastikas. The pivotal witness for the prosecution was Linda Kasabian. Kasabian was a member of the family who had been present at the crime scenes but had not inflicted any injuries. She had acted as the lookout. Horrified by the violence, she fled the family and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was crucial. She provided the jury with a first-hand account of the nights in question, detailing Manson's specific instructions. She described how Manson told Watson to leave a sign and how he ordered them to make the crimes look witchy. Bugliosi meticulously corroborated Kasabian's testimony with physical evidence. He presented the clothes the killers had discarded, which were found near the crime scene based on Kasabian's directions. He presented the fingerprint evidence. He dismantled the defense's attempts to portray the women as independent actors. He argued effectively that without Charles Manson, these young people would never have committed violence. They were the weapon, but Manson was the hand that wielded it. The jury deliberated for a week before returning guilty verdicts for all defendants on the 25th of January 1971. They were convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In the sentencing phase, the jury voted for the death penalty. However, in 1972, the Supreme Court of California, in the case People v. Anderson, ruled that the state's death penalty statutes were unconstitutional. As a result, the death sentences of Manson and his followers were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. The conclusion of the trial did not end the story's impact on American culture or the legal system. The Manson family murders are often cited as the moment the 60s truly ended. The trust that young people could hitchhike safely, or that doors could be left unlocked, evaporated. The counterculture, previously viewed with curiosity or mild annoyance by the mainstream, was now viewed with suspicion and fear. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of this tragedy lies in the realm of victims' rights. For years, the parole hearings of the Manson family members were quiet affairs, often unattended by the public. But as the killers became eligible for parole, Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, emerged as a fierce advocate. When she learned that one of the killers might be released, she launched a public campaign that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Doris Tate helped pass the Victims' Bill of Rights in California, which allowed family members of victims to give victim impact statements during sentencing and parole hearings. Before this, the pain of the survivors was largely excluded from the legal process. Because of Doris Tate, and later her daughter Patty, the voices of Sharon, Jay, Abigail, Wajech, and Stephen are heard every time a parole board convenes. They ensured that the narrative remained focused on the lives lost, rather than the celebrity of the killers. The forensic lessons learned from the case also reshaped police procedure. The failure to initially connect the Tate and LaBianca murders highlighted the need for centralized data and better communication between police divisions. The case underscored the importance of securing a crime scene against contamination, a standard that is now the bedrock of criminal investigation. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017, having never tasted freedom again. His followers, now elderly, have largely remained incarcerated, their petitions for parole repeatedly denied due to the severity of their crimes and the danger they pose to society. As we reflect on the events of August 1969, we are left to consider the fragility of safety. The Manson family murders were a collision of delusions and reality, a moment where the fringes of society struck at its center. It serves as a grim reminder of the power of manipulation and the devastating consequences when empathy is stripped away by ideology. The justice system ultimately worked, albeit slowly. It required the diligence of beat cops, the precision of forensic technicians, the courage of a whistleblower, and the brilliance of prosecutors to close the net. It proved that no matter how chaotic the crime, or how charismatic the leader, facts and evidence speak louder than delusions. In closing, this case forces us to ask a difficult question about the nature of influence. We often look for monsters under the bed, but history shows us that the most dangerous monsters are often those who can convince others that evil is actually a form of salvation. How do we guard our communities and our own minds against such manipulation? It is a question that remains as relevant today as it was in the shadow of the Hollywood Hills in 1969.